And thank you all for being here. It's so great for you all to join us. We have a nice big crowd tonight. We're just coming off the Maritime Heritage Conference last week in Buffalo. So we've been listening to all kinds of great presenters, and we've got another fantastic one for you tonight. We're going to be listening to Doug Most. He's a veteran journalist and author and serves as the Assistant Vice President and Executive Editor of the editorial department at Boston University. He's a former magazine and features editor at the Boston Globe for 15 years, and he also has written for Sports Illustrated, Parents, Runner's World, and is the author of 3 books: The Race Underground, a narrative story of the birth of the Boston and New York subways; Always on Our Hearts, a true crime account, and then what we're going to be hearing about tonight, Launching Liberty. He's a Rhode Island native, and he lives in Massachusetts with his family. His book is absolutely fascinating and right on target with our regular audience here at the National Maritime Historical Society. Before he launches into his presentation, we are going to look at that, launch into a preview of the book. So Heather, if you want to go ahead and cue that up.
In the early days of World War II, before Pearl Harbor pulled America into the fighting, our nation's fleet of cargo ships was tired, most of them relics from the First World War. Great Britain desperately needed more ships and asked America for help. The two nations struck a deal to build 60 British ships. It inspired President Roosevelt to launch his own emergency shipbuilding program, and with the help of the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, they would build the Liberty Fleet.
This is a memorable day in the history of American shipbuilding.
These welded steel Liberty ships stretched 441 feet, longer than a football field. But the first ones took half a year to build, far too long.
This whole nation is becoming one great fighting force.
Hundreds of thousands of men and women had to be trained in shipbuilding. And women became the most important shipbuilders. They became known as Wendy the Welder.
We must build more cargo ships, still more cargo ships, until we achieve a launching each day.
The Liberty ship became the symbol of what Americans were capable of when their freedom and democracy were at stake. The fastest Liberty ship was built in 4 days and 15 hours. In 3 years, America built 2,710 Liberty ships. The war would have been lost without them.
Doug, thanks for joining us tonight, and we're looking forward to hear about putting together this book and tell us a little more.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. It's fun to speak to audiences that I know are sort of specifically engaged in this subject. So it's fun to talk to people who are really sort of just interested in what we'll talk about. So let me tell you briefly, just by way of background, the Liberty ships of World War II. So if you don't know, let me give you just really brief background, and then I'm going to tell a couple of stories. So the Liberty ships were cargo ships. When the United States was not yet at war in early 1940, so the war is underway in Europe, and Germany and Great Britain are in a fierce battle. The United States has not yet been attacked at Pearl Harbor, and President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt at the time, he was very aware of the fact that war was coming, whether we liked it or not. He knew that this war was going to visit the United States. He didn't know when, he didn't know how, he didn't know in what capacity, but he knew it was coming. But he was faced with a very skeptical American public. The American public at the time had sort of embraced very much an isolationist opinion. If you think about what was going on in the world in 1940, it was roughly a decade removed from the Depression, but the country was still sort of coming out of that depression. And a lot of people just viewed what was happening overseas as not our war. That was Great Britain, that was Germany, that was not our fight. But the president knew otherwise. He knew that fight was coming. What he recognized also, and this was very important, was that when the war visited the United States, it was not going to happen on our turf. It was not going to be fought in New York City or in California or in the plains of Kansas. It was going to be fought over in Europe. That's where the war was going to be. And if we were going to be ready to fight a war over there, we were going to have to bring not only our troops to Europe, but all of our supplies. You've all heard the term the arsenal of democracy. That was what FDR was building at the time to prepare for war. He was building guns and jeeps and tanks, ammunition, airplanes. Everything was being built to prepare for war. But he knew that that arsenal of democracy would be useless if we didn't have a way to bring it to our troops overseas. The state of America's sort of cargo ship fleet at the time was really decrepit. We had let our arsenal of ships fall into disrepair. They were old, they were rotting, they were not prepared for war, the cargo ships. And so the president essentially launched an emergency shipbuilding operation. And that's what this book is about. This book is about President Roosevelt partnering with private industry to build the Liberty ships. Ultimately, America would build 2,710 Liberty ships over the course of roughly 3 years. It's a pretty remarkable number if you think about it. It's almost 1,000 ships a year. These are just cargo ships. So we're not talking about the military fleet and all of that, just these cargo ships. Almost 1,000 ships a year that we built. A Liberty ship was about 441 feet in length and 57 feet wide. So if you think about a football field, it's about 100 feet longer than a football field. So it was a long ship, but what really made the Liberty ships distinct was how deep they were. They were essentially the height of a 10-story building. Think of it that way. One Liberty ship had 5 cargo holds in it. Each of those cargo holds were massive. A single Liberty ship could hold 440 tanks. Think about that, 440 tanks in one ship. So now imagine what a fleet of these ships could hold. Or a single Liberty ship could hold almost 3,000 jeeps boxed up. One Liberty ship could hold the equivalent of a 2-mile-long boxcar train. So we can imagine a boxcar train 2 miles long. Now you could stuff all of that cargo on that train into one Liberty ship. So they were huge ships in terms of the capacity they had to carry enormous amounts of cargo. I want to tell you a couple stories. So the first story that I want to tell you is from 2023. I was about 3 years into writing this book. I'd been researching Liberty ships. I'd been studying them. I'd been reading about how they were built, who built them, the workers that built them. I'd read so much about the Liberty ships, but my research sort of felt incomplete, if you want to think of it that way, without really being able to see a Liberty ship. So there are 2 floating Liberty ships left in the country. There is one in San Francisco, and there's a second one in Baltimore, Maryland. The one in San Francisco is called the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, and the one in Baltimore is the SS John W. Brown. So on a summer weekend, I live up in Boston, I drove to Baltimore. I had arranged for a private tour of the John W. Brown with a retired firefighter who worked on the ship. The ship is essentially like a floating museum now, if you want to think of it that way. And I would highly recommend, if you have a chance, to go to Baltimore. It's not high on the list of tourist attractions, but I will say it's really a step back into history. So I drove down this gravelly road outside of Baltimore, and I got out and I sort of looked up and I was like, I'm standing next to a Liberty ship. It was sort of a pretty powerful moment to sort of look up at this ship and see how big it is, and to realize sort of that America had built almost 3,000 of these ships during a war to really help win a war. I walked up the gangplank, and on top of the ship, on the deck, I was met by my tour guide, and he was great. He took me first around the deck house of the ship, where I got to see where the ship was steered from, where the crew slept, where they ate, where they played cards. I really got to see sort of where everything took place. But then I walked down a metal staircase deep into the bowels of the ship with him. And when we got down to the floor of the ship, he took me into the first cargo hold. So we walk into this cargo hold, and it's really hard to picture this, but we walk into this cargo hold, and I can't tell you how big it was. It was so deep. There was a ladder that went up to the top of it, and it was covered by boards that were essentially there to protect it from the elements. But inside that cargo hold, which was mostly empty, I could sort of close my eyes for a minute and picture what it must have been like back in 1941, let's say, to have a giant Sherman tank, let's say, lowered into this cargo hold. I could almost picture it. It was just a crazy sort of moment, and really sort of powerful moment for a minute, to stand in that cargo hold and to picture, this cargo hold being filled with FDR's arsenal of democracy. And I really did pause for a moment when I was there and think to myself, this was where the war was won. And what I mean by that is certainly nothing will ever take away from what the troops did in the war, right? The troops fought the war. Nothing can ever take that away. But they couldn't fight the war without the guns, the ammunition, the jeeps, the tanks, the supplies that were brought to them on board these ships. One ship could feed 1 million soldiers for a day. One ship. So now again, imagine a fleet of them. So that was a really moving and important trip for me to take, because it helped me see the ship, envision the ship, and really be able to describe the ship in a more detailed way than I ever could have if I had never set foot on a Liberty ship. It was important for me to do that. So one element of the book that I really enjoyed researching and writing was the people who built these ships. So I want to tell you just really briefly about one of the most instrumental and influential characters in the book. His name was Henry Kaiser. So if I say the name Kaiser to you, I'm going to guess that the first thing you think of is healthcare. Kaiser Permanente Healthcare, which was indeed started by this same Henry J. Kaiser. But back in the early 1930s, Henry Kaiser was a contractor, a businessman, a builder. He built roads and bridges and dams in the Pacific Northwest. He's from upstate New York. He was born in 1882. And in the 1930s, he was in his 50s, and he was a very successful builder of big, giant things, roads, dams, bridges, all those things. He won a contract in 1931 to build what was then the largest public works project in American history, the Hoover Dam. It was actually called the Boulder Dam at the time, but it became the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was built by Henry J. Kaiser and his team, and it was finished 2 years ahead of schedule and several $1 million under budget. By doing that project so successfully, what Henry Kaiser did was he landed on the map of some important people in Washington, namely the president. So the president at the time had just inherited an economy that was really in the toilet. He inherited a Depression-era economy in the early 1930s, and he was trying to rebuild America. Henry Kaiser and President Roosevelt recognized that they could use each other. Roosevelt visited the opening of the Hoover Dam. He came out and attended the ceremonial opening of it, and he was so impressed with it that he really became sort of friendly with Henry Kaiser, because he recognized that a man like Henry Kaiser, who could build things, could get things done, could mobilize a workforce, all of those things, that was a valuable friend to have at a time when Roosevelt was trying to create jobs and rebuild the economy. Likewise, Henry Kaiser, his entire business depended on government contracts. His business was government work, building things. He could use a friend like the president. That'd be a valuable friend to have. The two of them became partners. In the late 1930s, war breaks out in Europe. Early 1940, they start thinking about building ships. And when President Roosevelt and the Maritime Commission needed someone to build Liberty ships, to build these giant cargo ships, Henry Kaiser stepped forward. And he became the builder of the most Liberty ships in the country. There were 9 different shipyards across the country that built Liberty ships. He owned really 3 of them, predominantly in Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, Oregon, and then he also ran one in Richmond, California, which was his busiest one. So Henry Kaiser ended up building the most Liberty ships. But what he also brought to the table, and this was one of the things that really was critical to the Liberty ship program, and I write about this in the book, he brought an element of competition to the building process. In order to build 3,000 Liberty ships, they had to be built fast. It was really, really important that these ships be built fast. And the first Liberty ship that was built in early 1941 took almost 8 months to build. 8 months. Everybody recognized that that was way too slow. That was not going to be fast enough. Slowly but surely, they started to figure out a way to build them faster and faster. Took them a couple of months, but they got the process down where eventually became 6 months, and then 3 months, and then 2 months, and then 1 month. They were building ships in 1 month time. Henry Kaiser in 1942 in the summer, in order to sort of build morale and excite his workers and even excite the nation, set up a competition between 2 of his shipyards. And I write about this in the book. He told his shipyards in Portland, Oregon, and in Richmond, California, you're in competition with each other to see who can build the fastest Liberty ship. The one in Portland, Oregon, built a ship in 26 days, a Liberty ship in 26 days. Richmond, California responded and built a Liberty ship in 18 days. Portland responded and said, we can do faster than 18 days. And they built a Liberty ship in 10 days. And everybody assumed when they built a ship in 10 days that that was a record that would never be broken. Except the workers in Richmond said, hang on a minute. They compiled a list with their workers of all the ideas they could come up with on how to cut an hour off of the process here, an hour off of the process there. And if we worked around the clock 24/7, how fast could we build a Liberty ship? In November of 1942, November 7th exactly, a whistle blew in the Richmond shipyard, and they began working on the SS Robert E. Peary. That ship was finished in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It was the fastest Liberty ship ever built. That record would never be broken. And it was a remarkable display of ingenuity and creativity and hard work. They worked around the clock for 4 straight days in shifts. Workers would come off a shift, they would stay at the shipyard, then go back on a shift. It was really an incredible feat that they built one Liberty ship in less than 5 days. The second story that I want to tell you is that in writing about the Liberty ships, when you're researching World War II, one of the things that you come to realize pretty quickly now, if you think about the math, which I did, we're talking about 1940. So I'm researching and writing about something here in 2020. So if I wanted to find somebody who worked on a Liberty ship in 2020, they would have had to be born roughly around 1920, because they would have been roughly 20 years old at the time of the war. And that's a young worker. So if you do the math, as I did, that meant that I was going to be looking for people who were 100 years old. So I spent a lot of time trying to find people who worked on Liberty ships. And to be honest with you, it was sort of fruitless. I kept striking out. It was hard to find them. I would occasionally find someone who had celebrated the 100th birthday or recently had been celebrated in some way, but then unfortunately I would also find an obituary for them a couple years later. So I never really found someone until this August of 2023. I was reading a newspaper in Maine, and I came across an article about a husband and a wife who were celebrating their 100th birthdays. And they both had worked in the shipyard in Portland, Maine on Liberty ships. So this was 2023. I was able to track down an email address for the daughter of one of these workers, the man, tracked down his daughter. And I sent her an email and I told her what I was doing. And she said her mother had passed away a year ago, but her father was still with us. He was 102 years old, and he was sharp as a tack, and he had tremendous memories and would love to talk to me about his time working in the Portland shipyard. I was tempted to say, "Can I come up tonight?" He was 102. I didn't want to waste any time. But I went up about 2 weeks later, and I visited with her and with him. His name is Arthur Babineau. We sat down in his kitchen. I met Arthur in their house. We sat down in Donna's kitchen, his daughter. And for about 3 hours, Arthur just talked to me about what it was like to work in that shipyard. He told me stories about riding a bus every day to the shipyard. He told me the story about riding on the bus one morning and hearing about the attack at Pearl Harbor and what everybody felt when they heard about the news. He talked to me about what it was like. His job in the shipyard was to inspect the welds in the ships. And he told me about what that was like to inspect the welds in the ships. And he remembered one particular ship he found that had some faulty welds and it had some cracks, and it had already passed inspection. And it had to be opened back up and re-welded and repaired before it could go out to sea. Sitting there with Arthur for 3 hours was really, I would say for me, one of the most sort of moving parts of my reporting on the book. Here was a guy who was 102 years old, who was there during World War II, who helped build these incredible ships, and still had this memory of the time doing that. It's also where he met his wife. They were married for almost 80 years before she passed away. So that interview is included in the book because it was important for me to include Arthur's story as a living sort of testament to the Liberty ships. Unfortunately, Arthur did pass away about 6 months after our interview. I stay in touch with his daughter to this day, and she was grateful that I was able to just meet with them and include a little bit of her father's story in the book to keep his memory alive. So I shared that story with you because I just wanted you to understand that, you know, these ships were built by human beings, by real people. So many things today are built by machine, right? These ships were built by bare hands, welding and riveting and piecing ships together, piecing parts of metal together. Just a remarkable achievement. It really was. Each Liberty ship had about 250,000 parts. And seeing one of those ships come together must have been remarkable. There are some videos out there that show ships coming together, but they're sort of condensed and quick, but they're pretty interesting to watch. those were two stories that I wanted to tell you, just to give you a little flavor of what it was like to report and write this book. The Liberty ships played, and I can't overstate this, just an instrumental role in World War II. They were pivotal to the victory of America. The troops overseas would not have been able to fight the war that they fought without the cargo that these Liberty ships brought over. The book took me about 4 years to write. It was a lot of research, but the research was incredibly enjoyable for me. Researching World War II is fascinating. One of the things that's interesting and challenging about researching World War II is that you come across so many rabbit holes that you can go down. And when I was writing this book, I really had to fight myself to not go down some of those rabbit holes and to keep myself focused on the Liberty ships, because there are so many books that have been written about World War II, and I didn't want to get distracted by some of the other interesting things that I uncovered. But the book sort of, I think, tells what I consider to be sort of an unappreciated or underappreciated element of World War II, which was the ships that supplied our troops. So I will stop there for a moment. I have a couple of pictures that I wanted to show you, and then I'm going to take some questions. So that's the cover of the book, as you can see. A quick thing about the cover, for those of you who are curious how this process works when a book is designed by a publisher. Typically what happens is your editor will send you 3 or 4 different options for a book cover that they've come up with. And they will say, here's some things that our designer came up with. Tell us what you think, and let's come to an agreement that we all like. This was unusual because one day I got an email from my editor, and he said, I'm doing something I've never done before. I'm sending you one cover because it's the only cover we were shown. And everybody immediately said, we love it. And that was the end of the conversation. And he said, I hope you like it too. So I did. I loved the cover. I thought it was a great cover. This is the first Liberty ship that was built to Patrick Henry. And so that's a great image that I think captures sort of the scale and size of these ships. So these are two men, Robert Thompson on the left and William Francis Gibbs on the right. Robert Cyril Thompson was a ship designer in London. And the story in the book begins with the story of Robert Thompson coming to America. His design of a cargo ship is what the Liberty ship is based upon. So he was a London ship designer, an British ship designer. He actually designed a ship that became the foundation for the Liberty ships. On the right, William Francis Gibbs was really considered America's preeminent ship designer. And he was charged with taking the designs that Thompson created and essentially Americanizing them. He had to take a British ship design and basically redo it for American shipbuilders. And so they both played really, really critical roles in the cargo ship, Liberty ship process. This is a picture of Henry Kaiser on the left in the glasses and FDR at the launching of a Liberty ship. It just shows the camaraderie and the collegiality and the friendship that these two men had. At one point in the mid-1940s, Henry Kaiser became so popular that he was actually rumored to be a vice presidential candidate for FDR. He was very, very popular, largely because of the Liberty ship program. This was a Robert Sewell who owned the Portland shipyard and became the pivotal player on the building of the Liberty ships on the East Coast. It's an aerial view of the shipyard in Richmond, California. This shipyard was built on a mud flat out of nothing, right across the river from San Francisco. And it produced the most Liberty ships in the country. I didn't get to talk about this, but I will really briefly here. Women were absolutely instrumental in building the Liberty ships. It was discovered early in the process of building Liberty ships. They were welded together. They were not riveted. They were welded. One of the things that was learned was that women were actually better at welding on the Liberty ships than the men were, because women had the ability, with their thinner arms and their dexterity, to get into tight corners and crevices to do some welding that the men couldn't reach. And so women became the best welders and became really, really pivotal in building the Liberty ships. They were the fastest welders, faster than men. Whoops, sorry. Lost my screen there. Right.
It's still up on our screen.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is just an illustration that I had done of the Liberty ship. It shows you the 5 cargo holds in tan. And just gives you an idea of sort of what a Liberty ship looked like. As I said, ships came together at the start in 6 to 8 months, but they eventually were coming together much, much quicker. This is how the ships were launched into the water. The launchings were big ceremonies. Huge crowds would come and watch a ship be launched into the water. Back to the illustration. And that's it. Those are some pictures I just wanted to show you. I do have a website, just I wanted to mention that. And obviously, the book's for sale wherever you like to buy books. I will say one last thing, and then I'll take your questions, and we'll get to some questions. Excuse me. If someone would like a book personally signed by me, which is something I love to do for people, sometimes some of these books are meaningful to people. I have a local bookstore near me. It's called Wellesley Books in Wellesley, Massachusetts. If you buy the book on their website, there's a little form that you can fill out that says, I want this personally signed by the author. They tell me, and I go over there and sign the book to you. And it's nice. I get to support a local bookstore instead of supporting Amazon, which I'm also happy to do, but they don't need my money as much. And it's nice to support a local bookstore, and I can personally sign the book if you buy it from Wellesley Books. So I just want to mention that. So questions, how about we do that?
Fantastic. Thanks, Doug. We've got some that were submitted in advance, and I'll remind folks that if they want to submit questions, the chat is the place to do that. If this is your first time joining us, we keep everybody muted just because there's so many people on the Zoom. So we'll go through the chat. We're definitely not going to be able to get to everybody. There's so many questions coming in that I'm going to have to scroll back up to the top. Doug, I've actually I'm a nautical archaeologist, so I've dove on 2 Liberty ships to document them.
Wow.
One off the coast of Maine years ago, which I can't remember the name of, but the other one is the Quartet, which is sunk out in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands.
That's crazy.
I
That's
think
crazy.
sank in the 1950s, going aground on Pearl and Hermes Atoll out there. These are massive vessels. And some of them, the one in Maine was a ferrocement vessel, which is a really unique design as well. And so a couple of the questions we have coming in has to do with the seaworthiness of the vessels. They were built so quick. Was there a lot of criticism at the time, or once they were underway and working, were there problems because they were built so quickly?
So here's what I'll say about that. They were absolutely seaworthy, and the overwhelming majority of them sailed many, many missions and successfully did what they were supposed to do. Having said that, somewhat early in the process, some cracks were discovered in some of the hulls of the ships. The question became, what was causing the ships to have some cracks? Most of the time, the cracks were not fatal. They could be repaired and they could be put back to sea. But eventually, 2 causes for the cracks were discovered. One was substandard steel, where the steel was not consistent around the country, and some of the steel was flawed, and that was a problem. And then sometimes it was the welding, which didn't always stick. So there were 2 reasons that some ships developed cracks, but the vast majority of the ships were safe, were seaworthy, carried out their missions, and really had very few or no problems at all.
And so, and did a lot of these ships continue after the war with careers? If so, what are some of the uses or stories that you have about any of that post-war period?
Yeah, not so much. They really served a purpose. One of the controversies was there was debate when they were deciding to build these ships about whether this design made sense, because some people, some maritime officials, did not want these ships built. Their concern was that they would be too short-lived, that they
Mm,
would only be able to basically have a usefulness during the war, but they would be used less once the war was over. President Roosevelt took the position of, I don't care. I need ships built quickly and I need them right now. And I can't wait for the best design, the best ship, the fastest ship, the most beautiful ship. I need a lot of ships and I need them right now. Roosevelt's willingness to sort of set his ego aside and do that and say, just build me a ship. These ships were nicknamed the Ugly Duckling for a reason. They were not pretty ships, but that's how we were able to build them so fast. Um, After the war ended, they really were useless. They were not used for many other things. They served some freight roles in the 1950s, but not much. Most of them were sunk. Some of them were destroyed for the steel, but they really were used for the war, and that was it.
mm. Now, a couple of our friends from the John W. Brown did want to mention that she started her career, or at least served a career, as a school ship
Right?
in New York,
New York City,
which is notable and unique, right?
very unique. Yes, a public school in New York City on a Liberty ship. It was very unusual, quirky, weird. Um, wasn't for a long time. I think it was only for a few years. But yes, it was a very unusual but creative use of an old ship.
Well, and use as a training ship is a lot
Right.
of vessels during the war, and
Right.
were able to remake themselves like that. We also have some of our friends from the SS Jeremiah O'Brien on tonight in San
Oh, that's great.
Francisco, our other Liberty ship, and they want to point out that. The O'Brien is an operational museum ship and has been
Right.
since 1979, and the only ship to steam under her own power that came out of that mothball fleet. So I just wanted to give a shout out to them. And I got a
That's
couple
great.
of people from the Brown who said she was a school ship for 36 years. So
Oh, wow,
there
it's
you
longer
go.
than I thought. Okay, it's longer than I
Yeah,
thought. That's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah, yeah.
I'm hoping to go visit the Jeremiah O'Brien. That's on my list. I'm in touch with a couple of people there, and I want to come out there and do an event there. So I'm hoping if anyone on the call uh, has some weight and can help figure out a way for me to do an event out there, please reach out to me because I'd love to come out there.
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So now there's a couple more questions about your research. So um, what kind of sources were you using?
Yeah.
If folks are interested in these kind of vessels, where would you suggest they look, archives,
Yes.
sources, things like that?
So my research was, let's say, lots of different ways. So um, archives of certain people. So Henry Kaiser's papers, for example, were invaluable to me. They're actually at the library in Berkeley, California,
Mm,
UCal Berkeley, and so they were instrumental to me, and I was able to access those um, archives. Needless to say, President Roosevelt's archives were also hugely helpful to me. His archives is at the FDR Library in New York. So those were two that were very valuable. Then beyond that, I will say, one of the most fun parts of research is reading old newspapers. Newspapers were such an incredibly valuable tool for storytelling. So I did a lot of research on newspapers through the internet. As an old newspaper guy myself, whose career started in newspapers, that was fun for me. Um, and newspapers played a really critical role in my research. Um, and then it was beyond that. It was just finding as much as I could on some of these individual people. I would find a character who I was interested in writing about, and I would try to go dig up as much as I could on them through various channels, museums, archives, libraries, wherever I could. I would occasionally get lucky. One of the key characters in my book is a guy named Clay Bedford, who worked for years for Henry Kaiser. Um, through research, I was able to find that his family, his grandchildren, are in Connecticut. I reached out to one of them, and turns out they had his entire collection of materials in their basement. And so I went over to their house in Connecticut, and she was willing to gift it to me for a couple of months. I took it back to my house, and it was amazing to have that access. And I thank her in the acknowledgments because it was great to have that. So stuff like that was part of the research.
Excellent. And just on the topic of research, thank you, Paul. Johnston pointed out that the Smithsonian holds the original design drawings for the Liberty and Victory ships donated by the Maritime Administration.
Right.
So there certainly are sources out there. And I just want to say there are so many great comments here. Rick, thank you for or Bill pointing out to me. No, wait, who just said? Doug pointed out that the John W. Brown also takes out passengers. They do a couple cruises a year. Another interesting thing about the Brown, she delivered thousands of pounds of spam to starving Russians, which again, kind of cool point. And then a couple folks had points about uses of some Liberty ships after the war. The John Longstreet was used as a target ship in Cape Cod Bay. Afterwards, thank you, Bill. And then Matt mentioning that the Greeks were still operating some of our Liberty ships up until the 1970s. So they were, again, not so useful for our shipping fleet,
Right.
but used for these various things around the country. Let me see here. A couple other things. What about so during the war when these vessels were taking supplies and goods around the world, uh, did they have protection? Were they sailing in consort? And
Yeah.
were any of them sunk in service during the war?
Yes, that's a great question. So one of the big questions that came up during the decision about how to build the ships and what they should be, what that should entail was, should the ships be armed? Should the Liberty ships be armed? It was a big debate. Eventually, it was a compromise that was reached where they were, what I would say, lightly armed. So they were not going to be military ships. They were cargo ships, but they had some firepower on them, but not heavy artillery. It was essentially, they were essentially given theoretically just enough firepower to hopefully hold off a sinking or hold off another battleship long enough to get the crew off and to sort of, save themselves. But that they knew they were never going to win a fight. So it was really just to lightly arm them just enough. They did often sail in flotillas and convoys. So they were often protected by military ships, but sometimes that didn't always work. They would have to scatter in the ocean. Liberty ships, when they scattered, were like sitting ducks. They were slow. They only traveled 11 or 12 knots, so they were really vulnerable on the open water. So that was a problem. But yeah, the answer to the question of did some of them get sunk? Absolutely. Some of them did get sunk. I do devote one chapter in particular to a famous fight that took place on the open ocean when a German raider known as the Steer came upon a Liberty ship and assumed that they were going to sink it in 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And Liberty ships, you have to remember, when a German ship would spot one, it was sort of like spotting like a golden ring. They took special pride in taking down a Liberty ship because they knew it was President Roosevelt's pride and glory and his big achievement. So Liberty ships were sort of special targets for Hitler and his ships. In this particular case, though, the Liberty ship that was confronted, the Stephen Hopkins, put up an incredible fight against this German ship that was not expected. And ultimately what happened was both ships were sunk. And it was the first time a Liberty ship really successfully not only defended itself, but took down a German ship. And they were hailed as heroes when they were rescued and saved and came back to America. And a future Liberty ship was in fact named for the captain of the Hopkins ship.
Wow. And I'll kind of there's a whole category of questions that are coming in, and if you're not if you haven't opened the chat, I encourage you to do so because there's a lot of great conversation and kind of facts going back and forth over there. But a lot of the grouping of questions that I want us to end on are there some lessons from what was done back then that we can take to heart today? Our fleet, our U.S. merchant fleet, used to be number one in the world, and it's been taken down a few pegs, right? We've really slowed down compared to what some other countries are doing. What are some of the lessons? Are there lessons that we could take out of what came out of the Liberty Ship program?
So I've been thinking a lot about that lately because I've been actually trying to write an op-ed about that. You know, one of the things that I was struck by, and I touched on this before, the reason the Liberty Ship program was so successful was there was a leader of our country who did something that's hard for any leader to do. And I'm not talking about just this leader today. He set aside his own ego in making the decision to build something that he knew was not going to be pretty or fast or beautiful or something that America could point to as sort of a great, wow, look at this amazing thing that we built. It wasn't going to be that. It was never going to be that. The president sort of made this decision and said and told his people, build me ships, period, full stop. I don't care what they look like. I don't care how ugly they are. I don't care how slow they are. I just need a lot of ships and I need them right now. And that was a really pivotal and important decision for a president to be willing to make. Not every leader could do that. Some leaders might say, bring me the best design and the best ship and let's build that ship. And if that had been the case, we would never have built 3,000 of these things. It would have taken too long. And we certainly wouldn't have been able to build them as quick as we did. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you ask me, what do we need to do today? It might be something similar to that. It might be come up with a design that maybe isn't the greatest ship ever built, but instead is a ship that can be easily replicated, built anywhere in the country, built quickly, and has just enough bells and whistles to work well. It can be modern, it doesn't have to be retro, but it doesn't have to be the greatest ship ever invented. And I think that's something that's hard for us to do. But if I was going to, see us try to replicate something or learn from the Liberty Ship program, I think that would be one lesson I could see.
That's great. I really like that you said that. Focusing on the mission. What's most critical? It's the quantity, right? It's serviceable, and using those. I don't want to say shortcuts, but efficiencies to get what you need, which was the tonnage, right?
Right. Exactly.
Let's see. One last comment from the chat there. A great reference book for the sinking of merchant marine ships. Early in the war is Operation Drumbeat by Gannon.
And that was, people asked me about my research. That was one of my books. I have it right behind me on my big bookshelf, which has about 100 books. It's on there.
Excellent. Again, Doug, this has been a great talk. If you haven't read this book, please go out and get it. We see Heather just put the link to Doug's website right there.
Thank you. And that does have a link to Wellesley Books on it. When you go there, you'll see.
Perfect. Excellent. And the folks from Jeremiah O'Brien, somebody chimed in and said, yes, absolutely. We look forward to having you come out and work with us. So we'll make sure you get some individual contacts with the folks out there. I love. Oh, go ahead.
I can make one other request real quick. It's just important for authors as they're pushing a new book. Forgive this point. If you do happen to read the book and you do happen to like the book, even if you don't love the book, we're always encouraging people to post a review on Amazon, because on Amazon it is how readers engage with books. They look to see, did other people read this book? Did other people like this book?
Yeah.
So I would just ask you, if you don't mind, it can be a one sentence review. I don't care, but it just helps other people engage with the book and see it. That's all.
Absolutely. And hey, this is a great group to do that. They're engaged, they're passionate.
Right.
Um, you can see that from a lot of the comments on the side there. There's personal stories, people's families. Again, thank you so much for doing this tonight. If you've enjoyed this talk, you're also going to love what we're doing next month. So remember, this is every first Thursday of the month at 7 p.m. So that puts us at November 6th. And this is going to be a fascinating talk. This was one that we came across at a maritime conference earlier this year, and immediately ran up to the presenters and said, you need to come and be on our seminar series. It's called Unlocking the Wisdom of the Ancient Canoe. And this is by Stormy Hammer and Jason Rucker. His name is really Stormy Hammer. I'm not kidding. He is a Haida canoe carver from Kisan, Alaska, and he's helping to revive the tradition of ocean-going dugout canoes. And his presentation is with Jason Rucker, and he's a filmmaker using not only using all kinds of documentation, including 3D imagery to document and preserve the work. They'll show stories, images, insights, and how the history and living tradition come together. Again, like Doug's, I think some really extraordinary people doing research and doing work in the world today on all the stuff we love and are passionate about. So again, same thing, we'll send out notices, but you can always sign up and join us on seahistory.org. And Doug, thank you again for your time and sharing your stories and work with us. And I thank you, everybody else, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And stay in touch, people. Feel free to reach me on my website. You can email me there, and love to hear your stories. So thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.